This is easily the most frightening thing to ever happen to me in my life. I grew up out in the country. My family lived out on a ridge. We had a very large extended family who was scattered all throughout the entire tri-state area. This being the case, I was generally pretty used to the rural settings and was never really afraid of it, even though it tends to get much darker, and I know many people find the darkness of the country to be quite scary in itself. I never really did, though. But of course, this story takes place in the dark, and it's pretty scary as well. I had been over at my aunt's house babysitting my cousins while she was working the second shift at work. She got home pretty late and offered me to remain over and to sleep the night there. I was really tired, though. I was also never the type of person who was ever able to really get a good sleep at anyone else's house, so I declined the offer. I set out on my way home. I had only recently begun driving at all, much less driving places I'm not familiar with in any way, and although I had driven to my aunt's house in the past, it was never this late at night. What I had to do, since my aunt lived in an adjacent state, was get down off the hill that she lived on. I would then take a gravel road out to a paved route, which would eventually get me to town. I would then head for the bridge that would take me over the river, back into my own state. I had been driving for a while, thinking that everything was fine. You know how a lot of times when you get lost, you don't really realize that you're lost at first. But then you slowly begin to realize that you've been driving around for a bit and notice it's taking you longer to get to the place than you assumed where you were going. Well, that is exactly what happened to me on this night. I was trying to get down off the hill, like I mentioned to you, but strangely, at one point, the road turned, and I realized I was suddenly going back uphill. At that point, I realized I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. Obviously, I should not have been going back uphill at any point during that drive. At first, being lost didn't really bother me too much. I figured I'd just find a quick place to turn around in, and then I would be able to make it back to where I had been trying to go in the first place. However, as I kept on driving, I realized there were not exactly a lot of driveways to just turn around in, and the road I was driving on was way too skinny for me to do a 3-point turnabout on the road. Hell, it was way too skinny to even have a car traveling in the opposite direction. The only driveways that I had passed at that point were gated off, and there was not much room for me to turn around in them. Still, I wasn't completely worried. I mean, like I mentioned, I didn't find the darkness of the country to be particularly scary. I grew up in it my whole life. I knew that if I just kept on my way, I would eventually find a way to turn around and get back to the road I needed to. I wasn't worried at all, but then I saw something up ahead of me. I slowed down just a bit because I noticed it was a person, a man, walking down the road all by himself. He was walking on the inner part of the road, on the very narrow strip of land between the hill and roadway. He didn't have a flashlight or anything, which meant he was walking alone in the pitch dark before my headlights had fallen on him. I slowed down a little bit, mostly because I didn't want to actually hurt the guy by accidentally running him over. I began wondering if I should ask him if he needed help, or any assistance. For some reason, though, I immediately disliked that idea of asking if he needed help. He was a man walking all alone on a dark country road on a hill, in the middle of the night without any equipment. It was just strange, and I decided it would just be best to stay out of it and continue on my way. As I passed him, though, I saw him staring at me through the windshield. When I was going right past him, he rushed and grabbed onto the handle of my car door, trying to pull it open. Fortunately, the door was locked, so he wasn't able to pry it open. He began pounding on the window of the door extremely hard, like he was trying to break it open. The man also began yelling at me, but I was too freaked out to really hear anything he had to say. In my panic, I stomped on the gas and tried my best to get away. Since I was going uphill, this was a dangerous thing to do, as the road was extremely curvy, but at the moment that wasn't exactly my major concern. At first, the guy kept up with me, but soon I was able to speed up to a point that he had to stop his pursuit. I managed to break away from him. I was so freaked out about what happened that I had to change my entire strategy to find me a way off the hill. I didn't want to turn around at that point, because then I would have to go back down the hill past that guy, and that was not something I wanted to do. I kept on driving, hoping the road didn't dead end. It didn't, but it did lead me to a few roads I was not familiar with. It took me a long time to find my way back to a place I was, and eventually I did end up getting home. Extremely late, of course, but at least I was safe. I don't know who that guy was, what he wanted, or even why he was out there, but I'm happy I never got the chance to find out. When I was 18, I was going to beauty college and lived in a trailer in a pretty sketchy trailer park. It was cheap and I needed a home at the time. One evening while I was home, I glanced out my window and happened to notice a man across the road from my trailer. He was smoking and pacing back and forth, right beside someone else's house that was a part of the park. It was extremely dark out, and he was not at their door, but near the side of their house. I closed my curtains, somewhat afraid. I didn't know what he was doing, and I didn't know the situation either. Whatever it was, he sure was interested in something in that house. He was forgotten, though, after he walked away, until a few evenings later. I looked out, and sure enough, he was there again, repeatedly walking, waiting, and chain-smoking. I decided I wanted to see what he was up to exactly, so I kept a keen eye out on him this time. Time passed by, and eventually a light came on in the room above him. The blind was raised a bit at the window. The man stood below it. I surmised this was probably a bedroom window. He raised himself up and stood on something, so he could be tall enough to stare into it. I didn't have a phone at the time, so I couldn't call anyone, and I was too afraid to confront the man on my own. I was still an immature young girl at the time. The next day, though, I walked right over to the landlord's office and told them what I had seen. I told them all about the guy and his seeming window peeking. They weren't surprised and didn't seem to care at all. He lived there in the park, and he happened to be good friends with them. Oh, him? He does that when he and his wife have a fight sometimes and she leaves. Wait, so you're telling me it's okay to rent to someone that peeks into other people's windows and be friends with them too? My jaw dropped. I was stunned. I went over to the house where I'd seen this happening and knocked on the door. A young woman answered. I told her about the pervert who had been looking into her windows and what had been happening outside her house the past few days. She said nothing. I think she was too shocked and afraid to, or maybe she just thought I was making it up. That night I stayed on watch, though. The blind was pulled down in the window this time. Nothing to see anymore. Good. So, no guy skulking around. Okay, it's over, I thought. That was the end of it. No. I came home late one evening, and the man was standing there on my porch. I sat in my car trying to think. I had nowhere to go but there. I think the landlord probably told the guy I'd seen him and what he'd done. The man suddenly jumped off my porch and ran around the back of my trailer. It was overgrown back there with high weeds and shrubbery and was a good hiding place. I jumped out of my car and made a dash for my porch. I ran inside, terrified. I crawled through my trailer to my bedroom, crying, with no one to help me to see if this guy was gone or even what he was doing. Since he lived there in the trailer park, I felt hopeless to tell anyone. After all, I had already found out he was well connected, and no one cared what he did. I even told an aunt of mine about it all. She said he just wanted to look. Was everyone else crazy, or was I? Had he been looking into my windows as well? Yes, I thought. I made the decision to move back to my mom's in another state. The last night that I was there, I sat in the dark watching TV, still leery of the guy. I spotted him walking up the sidewalk from the trailer park. He stopped and was staring up at the lit windows of a 2-story house, skulking around again. I was so happy to get out of there. No one ever confronted him, no police ever came. To this day, he's probably still peering into people's unsuspecting windows. My brother Rick and I, along with a couple of our friends, Dale and Joey, decided that because this was the last week of summer vacation, we would get our Stingray bicycles out and ride to High Trestle, a part timber and steel railroad trestle built back in the 30s. It crossed a precipitous ravine around a massive bluff about 3 miles southwest of town. It was called High Trestle because its highest point was about 100 feet above the ground. The trestle was also known for its length, at nearly a quarter of a mile. It curved around the bluff in such a way as to reduce visibility or detection at the last minute. It proved time and time again to take its grisly toll on anything and everything too slow to respond or caught by surprise. Even the single railroad crossing whose gravel roads serviced the farms north and south of the trestle would report automobile or tractor casualties when the train would barrel unseen and unheard eastbound from around the bluff. If you were on foot, you had only 2 options, and that was to either try and run or jump. For those unfortunate enough to have to choose, the gruesome result would always be there later for someone to find. Deer, coyotes, foxes, weasels, raccoons, cows, horses, dogs, cats, snakes, snapper turtles, and the occasional unwary human ventured out beyond the point of no return. They would get caught and either mowed down on the tracks, shoved off by the locomotive, or forced to jump into the gaping ravine below. Few survived the train or the plunge, and the remains would eventually be found either on the tracks above or broken on the ground, hanging on the support timbers occasionally that jabbed up like spikes in a bear pit below. Some timber sported a length of 40 to 50 feet and looked like a creosote-soaked petrified forest from above. They were still used for anchors or support in the construction and maintenance of the trestle. Our reason for going out there was always that maybe this time we'd find some hobo or gypsy or bank robber's bloodied and dismembered corpse strung out over a quarter acre, or maybe even some of the money one of the robbers had gotten away with while hiding out or making their getaway after knocking over the Mitchellville Savings and Loan Bank earlier that year. We never did find any actual human remains, but imagining the possibility almost always proved to be too much to resist. We were never, either together or alone, too shy or afraid of looking for stuff like that. It was just one of the many brainstorm ideas we had living in a small rural farm town in the early 1960s. Once we reached the trestle, the drill was to hide our bikes in some of the brush along the side, just in case someone from one of the nearby farms decided to teach us another lesson on 5-finger discounts. We'd made that mistake earlier, when another friend had gotten his bike stolen, and we all had to walk the 3.5 miles home. Likewise, we knew better than to take the bikes across, because we'd made that mistake once before too, and had to throw them off into the ravine and run like hell before the train mowed us off them. In that time, a fast-moving freighter nearly caught us when it suddenly and silently rolled around the bluff. Despite our age and barely passing marks in arithmetic and math, we somehow knew enough the amount of track and time it took for a 60-car fully laden freighter to cover the quarter mile across the trestle and come to a complete stop at 50 miles per hour. The rule was, if you had to cross it, always do it during the day, because then you could see to avoid it, but if it was at night, you would never see the light or hear the horn in time before it was suddenly upon you. Nobody wanted to end up like some of the victims we'd find, but being a young kid in a small town meant that you were always looking for something, whether forking hay with a pitchfork and a baling machine, cutting trees with a chainsaw and splitting the lengths into firewood with a 2-headed axe, or getting caught in a fire drill at school where all the kids in the upper floors had to descend a rickety old fire escape that turned out to be more dangerous than any actual or imaginary fire. It was all more or less like the proverbial watermelon, never tasting as sweet as when it was stolen from the neighbor's garden. Life in a small rural town without danger wasn't really living, and adventure without risk wasn't worth talking about. Once we reached the edge of the ravine and the beginning of the trestle, I could see the deepening shadow and the thin stream meandering its way down and out to the corn or soy, or whatever clover fields further south. I could feel the hot summer wind wafting up from below, and the hot summer sun baking my face and hands. I can still smell the tar and creosote on the ties and rail bed. Such as it was, looking back, it was like a little piece of heaven. We all knew that our only real choice lay in crossing the tracks above, because to descend into the ravine on this side was not only more treacherous, but also would add a lot more time onto an already rapidly dwindling day. Besides, where's the adventure in that? Fingering the chunks of rock flaked with pyrite I'd picked up along the tracks earlier, we made our way to the trestle. I imagined the rocks were magically endowed with some foreknowledge of things to come, and chuckled. Maybe it was another reason they called it fool's gold. Being the eldest, I asked everyone if they wanted to cross the tracks or go down. It would be quicker crossing the tracks, but it would also mean staying along the edge, and a sheer drop to avoid the splits between the ties, while at the same time avoiding the bolt heads along the entire length, not tripping or falling off along the way. We all agreed on the tracks and stopped for one last moment to check ourselves, say a little prayer and listen for any sound or vibration that would signal there was a freighter approaching. With all that out of the way, we beat it across, some of us on one rail and some on the other. Back then, whenever I would take the tracks home from school, I would always walk/balance on one rail as far as I could before falling off. Sometimes I'd keep from falling by jumping from one to the other. At other times I would count the ties in threes. 3, 6, 9, 12, standing on one and jumping to 3, etc., until I lost count. I did the same thing here, sometimes crossing between rails, counting the ties, avoiding the gaps and balancing on each one while running as far as I could without falling off. The 15 minutes it took to cross felt like 60, and we counted ourselves lucky, blessed, and not a little crazy. But that was all right because we would, we thought, live to fight another day. For most of us, to fight who or what didn't extend much, beyond the class bully who'd push the younger kids down on the playground, steal a swing belonging to someone else, or jump off the teeter-totter when somebody was on it. Seems like there's always at least one of those in every school. What, were they specially appointed? Elected? Just volunteers, maybe? It didn't really matter, because to us, bozos like him could never imagine what we did, let alone cross High Trestle, or make the ride it took to get there. All bullying and no play makes Jack a fat creep. And once we reached the other side, still panting and victorious, we climbed down to the creek, washed off the diesel dust and creosote, and looked for snapper turtles, searched for new victims, avoid the poison ivy, generally just hang out, until we decided to begin the journey back up and out for home. Finally, we began the ascent on the same side we descended, because the opposite was mostly vertical, and the soil extremely loose and wet from the rain the night before. Rather than crossing back on the rails again, and taking our chances with an oncoming train, we thought it would be safer and more fun to cross on the iron skirting that ran along the underside of the rail bed, just below the tracks. Since we were all still short and not yet our full height, we were able to scooch along under the rail, holding on to the upper fluted skirting with our hands, and the lower with our red ball jets. We passed the first girder at approximately 40 feet from the edge and 20 feet from the ground, silently, slowly, and patiently making our way to the next. The next put us about 100 feet from the edge and 40 feet off the ground. When we reached the 180 feet from the edge and 60 feet from the ground section, I was suddenly distracted by the sound of human chatter behind and south of us, downstream from the creek. Nobody else was supposed to be out here. We'd always made a point of not letting anyone else know. Secrecy was an essential element of our adventures. We didn't want anyone else to know apart from those who were invited, and they were sworn to secrecy or permanently banned. If our parents found out anything about what we were doing, we'd never be able to do anything again. We'd be perpetually grounded, hence the urgency of who was out there and how they had found out. Bracing my feet and hands on the edging, I craned my head back behind me to see who it was and what was going on. I discovered that it was Curtis, my once best friend but now worst enemy, because he tried to get me into a fight with Paul over a lie he'd told Paul about me. I began yelling at Curtis and his fellow thugs to get out of here, because he was no longer my friend, and I didn't want anything to do with him, when, trying to see behind me, I shifted my weight onto my left foot while surging along the flute with my right. My foot caught on the edge of a large bolt, throwing my weight sideways, spinning me around and forcing me to let go with both hands and jump out onto a 12 by 12 horizontal support beam that was nearly 6 stories above the ground and was holding up the skirt and track on this side of the trestle. Because my weight was now leaning forward, I instinctively hopped down onto a second and longer 12 by 12 support beam. Still off balance, I leapt deliberately and reflexively off the trestle. As I was falling, the rocks with the fool's gold in my jacket pockets and the uprush of air at first suspended everything above me like a makeshift parachute. I pulled my arms down and out using the jacket to catch as much wind as possible, thinking it might somehow slow my descent. Falling, I thought of all the stories about some old hobos or gypsies that had fallen off or jumped because they'd been taken unaware by one of the night trains, pitching them headlong into the ground or onto the jabbing forest of support poles below. As I started to scream, I thought I must have nearly reached maximum velocity. I made a point of trying to fall straight down, feet first. I imagined using my billowing jacket to keep me from tumbling and guide me between the creosote poles, some as thick as tree trunks jutting out of the ground below me. Somehow I managed to accomplish both, but once I hit the ground, the impact sank me up to my pelvis in the soft black topsoil that had eroded from the edges of the ravine and consequently knocked all of the air completely out of me. Gasping for breath, my brother and our friends moved quickly back across the skirting and down the side, screaming and crying. They thought I was dead or dying. Later, my brother Rick told me that the only word I uttered was calling for my mama. Curtis and some of his henchmen tried to come over, but my brother called them off for having caused it in the first place, and shortly thereafter they left. The sun started to set, but all I could think about was this savage pain in my back, leg, and arms. All had taken the brunt of the concussion, yet miraculously it seemed no bones were broken, just torn muscles and tendons. On the way home I tried to ride my bike, but the pain was so great that all I could do was lean on my brother or one of our other friends, take a few steps and fall immediately, or occasionally lean on the bike, take a few steps and then fall face first, slowly traversing that 3.5 miles home. It took nearly 4 hours to get there. When I got back, my mother wasn't there, so my older brother called her after drawing me a hot-as-I-could-take-it bath with Epsom salts. She apparently said she was too busy and hung up. She was probably at her bridge club. My mother and I were never close. When she finally did get home, she said it was my own fault and I had to live with the consequences. In spite of her, I took her advice and did. Taking me to a doctor somehow never occurred to her, but it did occur to my brother. He was so mad at her disregard, he called her a selfish bitch to her face and earned a pretty hard slap for it. For weeks I couldn't stand, except for short jaunts across the room, or from a chair to bed. I'd get a lot of reading in, though. Most kids would have relished an extended vacation, but for me, being home with her was far worse than anything bullies of the world could conjure up. It took 2 weeks of sleeplessness, pain, and fear, but I was determined that I would walk again. When I got back to school, my classmates thought I was kind of a hero, because I was the only person they had ever heard of who had fallen off that high trestle and lived. For months that fall haunted me. Of course, my mother told me to never go out there again, but I knew I had to, or I would be afraid forever, and so she would win. I somehow knew revisiting the trestle was the only way to conquer my fear and end this terror. It had to be done. One day, after delivering the Saturday morning register to the 24 homes on my route, I went back out on my bike by myself. I walked the entire length across and back. No trains came. Going back there was one of the most difficult things I had ever done. I remember the autumn wind blowing particularly hard against me all the way there. It was as though it was trying to knock me off my bike, and then off the trestle when I crossed as well. As though it was furious at me for getting away and having the audacity to come back. At one point, I thought I heard my mother's screams, as though she thought I were taunting her. Nonetheless, all the way back home, I took the return wind as an affirmation. I practically flew all the way there. I think she must have known, when after the beating from my stepfather for being late, she asked if I had gone back there. Of course I lied and said I hadn't. I'd learned a long time past that telling my mother the truth about anything, let alone talking to her about my thoughts or dreams, always resulted in verbal or physical abuse. Growing up, I lived with this belief that if I mostly just kept my mouth shut and answered yes or no questions, just did what I had to without her or anyone else knowing, I could avoid a lot of the pain, abuse, and heartache, and that whether she or anyone else approved or not, it didn't matter. One way or the other though, whether justified or not, I knew I was always going to pay a price for it. I believed the fault was, up until then, the price. At a fairly early age, I knew my mother was mad, and my stepfather a drunken brute. In spite of them, I had to survive to fight another day. Unbeknownst to almost everybody outside my immediate family, there was more than just bullies at school to contend with. All those years, despite the constant fear of pain and punishment, whether for real or imagined transgressions, I somehow knew instinctively what had to be done, at least for myself and my little brother. Over the years, I had learned to adapt to the circumstances at home, school, the playground, or on the street. I had developed a high tolerance for physical, mental, and emotional pain. I imagined myself stoically invulnerable to almost anything, but the truth is, no one is invulnerable. For all the pain and hurt one suppressed throughout their life, it will come back one day to haunt you. Somebody once said that everything you've ever felt, tasted, heard, smelled, seen, learned, or experienced is never forgotten. It's all there just under the surface, as fresh and clear and sharp as the day it happened. Somebody else once said that at the time of death or near death, all your life will flash before you. Many of us experienced that while growing up. Some of my schoolmates and friends lived to tell the tale, but others didn't. To me, the most important thing in all of this is to always remember and never forget what it is somebody else once said. In times like these, you learn who your real friends are. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you guys liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. That sort of stuff really helps me out with the audience engagement and really helps my videos get out to a lot more people. So hopefully we can get to that 1 million one day. Help me out, guys. That'd be great. Once again, starting this week on the second channel, we're going to be doing some true crime stuff. Probably twice a week if I feel in the mood for it and feel like doing all the research required. Those will be on Wednesdays/Thursdays and Saturdays/Sundays probably. So look forward to that if you're interested. There's a link to my second channel in the description. The name is Mr. Blue Sky, so keep an eye out for that. If you guys feel like contacting me for any reason, links to all of my social media will be in the description below, including my Facebook, Twitter, and Gmail accounts. Send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get back to you as quickly as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please make sure that it has proper grammar, and try to include as much detail as possible so it's long enough for me to include in a video. Also, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is, if it has one, what type of story it is, if it has a theme, and how you would like to be credited in the description of the video the story appears in. If you guys are curious about the art used in this video, links to my artist, Alan, will be in the description below. He does a lot of horror art stuff, and he's really good at it. He also does commissions, so if you guys have any projects you want to work on or something, please be sure to check him out. He can probably get you something really good. As usual, links to the music used in the video will be in the description below in the order which it appears. I think that's pretty much all for now, guys, so thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.